Welcome to another great episode right here on IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Ronnie Wong, and today we're taking a look at VMware's VCP6. And we've got a few different troubleshooting tools that we need to get into. And who better to help us than the VCP expert himself, Mr. Don Pizzette. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Ronnie. Ready to dive right back into the world of vSphere. And like Ronnie said, we're taking a look at troubleshooting tools. And I know, as much as we'd like to believe that VMware and vSphere have no issues whatsoever and everything always deploys flawlessly the first time, as we've seen in some of these episodes even, there's a lot of times where things don't quite go right. And so when that happens, we've got to be able to troubleshoot it. Now, the #1 single best troubleshooting tool is the knowledge base found at VMware.com, right? We can go and search for our problems, and a lot of times they've got documents that will talk about what that problem is and how to resolve it. But sometimes it's kind of hard to figure out where the actual problem is. And so there is a wide assortment of troubleshooting tools found throughout vSphere, through the whole suite, that we can use to better troubleshoot our system and try and find out more about what the problem is. And so that's what we're going to take a look at in this episode, and there'll probably be a part 2 because there's a lot of little tools in here that we can use. You've already seen me use some in the various episodes that we've covered, right? Some are just right there as part of the graphical user interface if you're in the vSphere web client, for example. But there are times where the vSphere web client is not working, or a host has become disconnected somehow. And now we don't even have the GUI to work with. And so there's some neat tools that we can use that let us troubleshoot a system from the direct console UI also. So a couple of different ways to go on this one, and we'll just kind of run through each. Let's start with a few general areas here. I want to kick things off with, let's just talk about vCenter for a minute, all right? If vCenter fails, it makes it really difficult for us to troubleshoot our network and keep things healthy and running, because vCenter is what we like to use. Now, the reality is, if my vCenter deployment were to take a complete dive right now, I could just format the server, put Windows on it, throw vCenter back on it, and rejoin my host and be back up and running in short order. So it's not like there's a ton of sensitive mission-critical data inside of vCenter, but it certainly is what keeps things running smoothly. And there is a database attached to it. If I format and reinstall, it'd be nice to restore that database too, so that's a lot of work now. So if we start having problems with vCenter, there are a few little steps that I like to take just to make sure that vCenter is running fine. And they all take place on the server itself. So let's take a look at my Windows server here. This is where I'm running vCenter from. And if I ever found an instance where I couldn't get into the vSphere web client, here's kind of where I'd start my troubleshooting. If the vSphere web client fails, if I just can't get to the login page or something like that, my first thought is this actually a vCenter problem, or is it just the vSphere web client? Because the vSphere web client has its own little issues. So one thing I like to do is on Windows, you can jump into your services tool, and the services tool will show you a list of VMware services, including the web client. So if I go into my server manager, and I'm going to go under Tools and Services, in the services list, we'll see a ton of stuff, and I'm going to make this window a little bigger because the names get truncated a bit. And I'm going to scroll down to the section of VMware services. So I'm just going to keep scrolling, and there's 1 or 2, or maybe 30 VMware services in here, right? There's a bunch of different VMware services, each one that performs a different role. And what I like to do is skim down this side column and see how it shows all these services for automatic startup. That means that when the system boots, these services should start. Anything that says automatic should be running. If there's a service that's not running, like this one, that may indicate a problem. But in this case, this is the VMware message bus config service, and see how it's disabled? It's disabled, so I expect it not to be running. But if something is automatic and it's not running, that's usually indicative of a problem. And I've seen it many times where you come in and you find the vSphere web client, and you go and look at its status, and it's set to automatic and not running, right, where it's crashed or something's gone wrong with it. So you may need to restart that service. Or if you're having a problem with a plugin registering, like I had that issue in the replication episodes, and if you just restart the service, sometimes that gives it a little kick in the butt there and gets it to register those things. If it fails to come up, then that's what leads us to our next tool. If it fails to come up, then it's going to register entries in our event viewer. In Windows, if we go back to our server manager, you can go to Tools and Event Viewer, and VMware will actually log all sorts of events into the event viewer. If you just drill down under Windows Logs and Application, so over here I just went to Windows Log and Application. Looking under the application log, see how we've got various things that are reporting in here. Most of these are not going to be VMware applications. They're going to be other systems. And I guess my system's kind of healthy right now, so we might have a hard time finding a VMware error. Oh, there's one right there. my VM upgrade helper logged some messages down here, and I can see it restored a network configuration, right? It's not an error, that's just a notice. But if something's wrong with the vSphere web client, it'll usually log to right here, and we can spot that, and it'll tell us what the problem is so that we can go and try and figure out how to fix it, right? Another thing you can do is, if the vSphere web client is not working, you can try the vSphere native client, right? If you go onto your installation disk, right, so that the disk you use to install vSphere, it's got the vSphere client right on that disk. Or if you have a host that's online, you can always browse to the host's web page and it'll be able to download from the host. But you can install the native client and connect that way. The native client doesn't have as many features as the web client, but it just directly accesses the vSphere APIs. So the web client can be completely dead in the water and the native client might still work. If it does, then you just have a problem with the web client, not a problem with all of vCenter. And so you may not need to restore. You can just go in and reinstall the web client and see if that fixes our problem, right? But if this doesn't work, if the web client doesn't work and the native client doesn't work, if they're both dead in the water, that's when I really have a vCenter problem. That's when I really need to look at my event logs and figure out what it is, troubleshoot it, and if I can't fix it, restore from a backup, right? We should be backing up this server, so restoring it shouldn't be that big of a deal. If it's a VM, you can always restore a snapshot. That makes life really easy and get your environment back up and running nice and quick. All right, so that's basically it for the vCenter side of things. Now, assuming that vCenter is working, then we'll have access to the WebSphere client, or the vSphere web client, and we'll have GUI troubleshooting tools. So anytime we have a problem with a host or a VM, a problem with storage, a problem with network, we'll be able to use the GUI. If vCenter is dead, then we may not be able to use a GUI. And in those scenarios, we'll have to use the command line to get in and start to work with vCenter, or just ESXi and those guys too. So there's a handful of command line utilities that we need to be aware of. And as we go through the rest of this show, I'm going to show both GUI stuff and command line stuff so that you can use whatever is available to you at that time. All right. This native client here is almost done installing. There we go. So once that's done installing, I can fire up that native client and I can point it right at my vCenter server. So I'm going to point it right at the server itself. And I'll put in my username and password. And you know, this is the same if you have the Platform Services Controller, the PSC, that it's got the PSC services, which I had here because I did an embedded install, but you can start and stop those services too, and sometimes that'll help you resolve an issue. All right, so I'm just going to get logged in, and now I'll be connected to my vCenter environment, but via a different tool. I'm not using the web services anymore. Now I'm using the native client, and there it goes. And certain features are going to be missing. If I have VMware data protection set up or vSphere replication set up, they're not going to show up in here because the plugins aren't loaded by default. There's going to be other things that aren't quite capable of being set up from here. But as far as basic troubleshooting and configuration, I'll be able to do it and try and get my system back online. All right, so let's talk about networking, right? So networking is something that is very easy to make a mistake on. When we configure a virtual machine and get it set up, when we configure a virtual switch, it's pretty easy to map them to the wrong adapter or plug something into the wrong port group. So verifying your networking is something you'll have to do a lot. In the GUI, it's pretty easy, right? On the workstation side, or server side, you can go into your VM list, you can find your virtual machine, and then you can jump under, well, really the summary right here, the main summary you go to, it'll tell us what network we're on, right? So I can see network adapter 1 for this virtual machine is currently plugged into VM network, right? I can see that on the summary screen, but I can't really do anything about it, right? If your network isn't functioning, it's usually going to be one of 3 problems, right? Problem number 1, I didn't install the VMware tools. The VMware tools have the driver for the virtual network adapter, and if you don't have that, your VM may not be able to see it. That's a really common cause of networking not working, all right? If that's the case, right here on the summary screen, you'll see a warning saying the VM tools are not installed. We saw that in the tools episode. The second issue would be that it's plugged into the wrong network. See how my network is the VM network? I might have 5 different networks. If I'm plugged into the wrong one, then I may not be able to communicate, right? And that's just a human error. We can see that right here on the summary page, and if we want to fix it, we can go to Manage, and then go down into our VMware hardware. We can edit our hardware, and then in that screen, you'll be able to change what network you're plugged into. So we can dive right in there, and you've got your network adapter, and you can choose from the networks that you've got. You can also give it a state of connected or disconnected. If you leave it disconnected, obviously it's not going to work, right? So we can verify that right here. It may not be a problem on the VM though. The problem might actually be on our virtual switch, right? Whenever you create a network, it's really a port group on a virtual switch. So if I have a problem on the vSwitch, that problem is going to extend to any virtual machine that's plugged into it. So I may need to check my uplinks. And if we go to the networking tab up here and choose a network, here's where you'll be able to come into the summary and get an idea of how this configuration is laid out. And if you go to the monitoring tab, you'll be able to see tasks and events that are assigned to this switch, and you may be able to spot issues that are going on there to be able to try and troubleshoot and find out what's going on. So you may have problems associated in here that tie to the vSwitch itself that aren't tied to the individual VM. Now, looking at it this way under the network tab shows us kind of a limited information. I usually prefer to go back to the home page and go into networking from here. And that kind of takes you to the same place where you're able to see that information and work with it. But because I've got a cluster set up, I'm not actually seeing my switch configuration here, right? I'm not seeing my DV switches. And so if you go back to your home page and go to your inventory screen, your vCenter inventory list, in here you can come through and actually see things a little bit more clearly because you've got distributed switches right down here that you can jump into. And oh shoot, I hit that little that vSphere web client bug that makes the UI reload on you. That is fixed in the latest update. I just haven't applied the latest update, so I need to do that. But once you go into your inventory screen and you go into your distributed switches, you'll see your switches right there, and that's a little bit better of a view. You'll have more options in there. So when I come in and look at my distributed switches, oh, I guess I'm just dealing with local switches right now, so I don't see it. But I'd see those switches and be able to modify them in their port groups. Now, I've got local switches, so where do we see those? Those are under the hosts, right? So if I go back to my host screen and I pick a host like ESX host 01, that will be able to come in here and see the switches that are tied to it. Right now I don't have any distributed switches, but if I go to manage and networking, I'll see where I have those local switches. And I can examine, really what I want to examine is this physical adapter, right? Which physical adapters are mapped to my virtual networks? If I have the wrong physical adapter mapped, or an adapter that happens to have no link light, then I'm not going to be able to browse the network. I might be able to talk to other VMs, but not the real network. So that's another thing that we'll definitely want to check. All right? These are all tools that are available to us right here through the GUI. Where the problem comes in, though, is what if I can't get to the GUI? What if this isn't available, right? If this isn't available, we actually do have command line utilities that we can use to be able to check this. Now, the command line utilities are available on ESXi if you access a shell. Thing is, the shell's actually disabled by default, right? If I want to try and remote into one of these systems, I can't do it. The way you do it is one of two ways. You can SSH in, right? So I could come in here and say SSH root at 192.168.0.201, right? So I'm going to try and SSH into one of my hosts with username root, okay? I get connection refused. And that's because SSH is disabled by default. The other option I have is that I could go to the console, right? So here's my ESX host 01. And from the console, you'll see on the screen way down here, press F2 to customize system or view logs, all right? Press F12 to shut down and restart. There's no press a button to access the console, is there? To access a shell. And that's because that's also turned off by default. What we have in here, if you do the F2, right? So if I press F2 and go into my configuration, right? If I punch in a valid password, there's some troubleshooting for us. So we put in a valid password. That's sad. All right, there. What it's going to do is it's going to take me to a simple menu. And as far as networking is concerned, there's really only one thing we can do in here. You can verify your networking, or you can do this network restore options. And what it'll do is it'll reset the management network back to defaults. That way, if you're not even able to remote into the system via the network, you can kind of put it back to the defaults and get in. But that's about it. You'll see you do have this troubleshooting options screen. And right in here, we can turn on the ESXi shell. We can enable SSH, right? Those two right there are what are going to allow us to access the command line utilities on this system, all right? They're not enabled by default, but we can turn them on. So if I choose that, if I choose enable ESXi shell, right? Well, it just changes to now say disable ESXi shell, right? It's now turned on. Or if I turn on SSH, right, it just changes like that, all right? But what really happened? Well, in the background, it updated the services to start the SSH service to make the shell accessible. And when it made that shell accessible, if I just back out of my menu, most of this stuff is not really going to change. It's all going to kind of look the same. But if I get back out to my main screen, the main difference that I'm going to have here is that I can now hit Alt F1. And Alt F1 will take me to a shell. I can press Alt F2, it'll take me back to this screen, but I've now enabled that kind of hotkey. So if I do Alt F1, there we go, I get a shell. And I can log in as root and what I want that password to be. And now I'll be able to, or sorry, not what I want the password to be, what the password is, which is not what I typed. So let me try that again. I can log in, and now I'm at the shell and I can work with the system. Okay, that's one way to be able to get in there and do it. The other way is SSH, right? So I'm gonna exit out of that, and I'm gonna hit Alt F2, and now it's back to this screen. Now I can walk away, right? You never wanna leave it logged in. Somebody could come behind you and try and log in. That's why we have those timeout values you might have noticed.
All right, Don, so that's great from the console. Can you show us that on SSH like you were talking about now?
Yeah, you know, SSH maybe not the best tool if we're having networking problems, right? Because you can't network in. A direct console you know you can use, but if the network is actually up, SSH is a great way to test it. And that failed for me earlier, right? Let me get back to my terminal here. So when I ran that connection earlier, what I ran was SSH root at 192.168.0.201, and I got that the connection failed because SSH wasn't running. But if I run it this time, I get, hey, we got a SSL certificate. Do we trust it? I'll say yes. And now it's asking for my password, and I can provide it. And now I'm at my ESXi shell,
nice.
Right? So now I'm able to access that console and use all the command line tools that are available for me. Now, when you get connected to VMware or ESXi shell, it is running a version of Linux, but it's not a version of Linux you're intended to mess with. So while you do have a lot of tools that are available, you shouldn't necessarily use them. So for example, like ifconfig. In the Linux world, this would show me all my network adapters and what their IPs are. The challenge we have here is there's a lot more to this network than just physical adapters, right? There's virtual switches, there's bridge groups, there's port groups, there's all sorts of crazy things. So when we look at ifconfig, what do I get? Command not found. VMware didn't even bother packaging the command in here because it's not useful. And things like IP ADDR, it's not there. These are common tools that we're used to having with Linux. So while it is Linux, don't expect the shell to be as familiar as you're used to. So for example, if I want to see my network adapters, on Linux I'd normally say ifconfig, but here I'm going to say ESX CLI, right? So the ESX command line interface is the most common tool that we're going to use. So I'll say ESX CLI, and then I'm going to tell it network NIC list. Give me a list of all the network adapters. And when I run that, there they are, right? And my screen is kind of wrapping because it's more data than what's going to fit, but if you stretch it out, you'll start to see it kind of level out a little bit. But here I can see VMNIC 0, 1, and 2. I can see if they're up or down, right? Maybe a link is unplugged. I would see it here. It shows that they are these Intel Gigabit Ethernet adapters. I can see their speed, duplex, and MAC address. So now I'm able to harvest a lot of information about those adapters. My management interface might be up, but my data network might be down, or my storage network might be down, and I can see it right here through the ESX CLI. Similar commands to that, we've got ESX CLI network vSwitch, which I can't spell, vSwitch standard list. And so I can pull up a list of any standard vSwitches I have. There's that vSwitch 0, that's the default one. You can see the number of ports and used ports and other configuration information on it, and any other switches you may have created. You can also see the port groups attached to it. And then there's ESX CLI network vSwitch DVS, which is for my distributed virtual switches, and VMware list. Now, I have to say VMware because remember, on a distributed virtual switch, you could actually be running Cisco's distributed virtual switch, right? You can throw in their Nexus image if you wanted, and so then it would be Cisco list or Dell list or whatever. But in my case, I just have VMware, and I can see that I don't have any present. So another way that we can go and check that configuration and status, it's a great way for verifying whether or not the problem exists on the host or if the problem is just in vCenter, right? Here on the network side, we're usually just verifying and testing. Most of the configuration that we need to do, we'll do through the vSphere web client or the vCenter native client. All right. One other thing worth mentioning, if you're ever having a problem with a host, sometimes a host can kind of become locked up or not registering properly, and we suspect it's the network because we're not connecting, but it could be that its connection with vCenter is just damaged. So another kind of technique that I've used from time to time is if I think the host is the problem, what you can do is if you go in your vSphere web client and you go into your host and clusters and you find the host that's giving you an issue, right? That you can disconnect the host. See on the right-click menu there, I've got connection and disconnect. If you disconnect it, that basically tells vCenter that, hey, that server's not there anymore. But it stays on your screen, so you can then right-click it and go to connection and reconnect. And when you reconnect, it's going to basically re-import that host into the system, but take over the same marker that it had before, so it's not creating a duplicate host, right? So it's going to bring it in and re-inventory it. That's really handy if you've changed the IP address of the host. We can just disconnect, reconnect with the new IP, and then we're in business, right? So it might not be that the network's broken, it might just be that the network has changed enough where we're not able to talk to it anymore without doing a disconnect and reconnect. All right, so those are all a couple of different options that we can go through as far as on the networking side. On the storage side, it's actually really similar, right? On the storage side, we can verify our storage configuration right here through our GUI. On any host, you can take that host, go to monitor, and under monitor, you'll be able to see a lot of information like hardware status. And under hardware status, you can come in here and you can view storage connections and so on because they're all right here. If I had any issues with storage controllers, they would show up and you'd be able to spot that, right? But more commonly what we do is we go to Manage, and under Manage, you can go to the Storage tab, and that's where we'll see our storage adapters and storage devices. And if you watch the episodes where we did data stores, I showed kind of troubleshooting iSCSI in that episode and how you might have bad IPs or whatever. When it comes to HBAs, like fiber HBAs, there's not much configuration for those. You just plug them in. So as long as they show up here on this screen, they're typically going to work. And so we may need to rescan our adapters. So we've got that rescan the storage adapter to find devices. We might have to rescan the host to see if a new controller has been added. If you just added a new HBA, we might need to rescan the host first to find the HBA, and then rescan the device to find, or rescan the HBA to find devices that are on the HBA. So you got a few different ways to do rescans and refreshes right here. Storage controllers almost always need refreshes like this. It's kind of annoying, but it does need to be done. If there's any real problems with storage though, they'll show up right on your summary screen. There'll be those yellow bars like, well, here, I've got these yellow bars. ESXi shell and SSH have been enabled, right? It's telling me, hey, I might need to remember to turn those off. If I'm going to keep them on forever, I just need to go over here and tell it to suppress the warning. Don't warn me about that. I know it's turned on. I want that. Don't warn me. Okay, so I can just suppress those, and that takes care of that. But if I have a storage problem, it'll show up right there. I'll be able to see it, and it'll tell me, disconnected from this data store. You'll see it on the data stores too. So if I go over here to my data stores, if I have like a iSCSI one or something like that, it might have a red diamond on it. And that's letting me know that it's been disconnected and there's a problem there. And I might need to reconnect it or something like that. You can unmount and remount the data store, which is similar to connecting and disconnecting a host, right? But for storage. You can also get really aggressive, where you go down here and you can delete the data store. Deleting the data store doesn't delete the data that's inside of it. The data stays there, so you can always import the data store back in again. I really don't like to do that because there is a risk you could lose your data, but it is one that you can do if it really comes down to it. If that data store is just not working, you can re-import it that way. So a few different choices there when we're dealing with storage.
So Dan, sorry. So Don, since we have this in the GUI interface, I'm assuming that we can also then do it in the command line like you're showing as well?
You can, yeah.
Okay.
It's a lot less common, right? Because if it's a storage problem, then usually our network is fine and we're able to access the GUI, and that's the way we're going to do it. But just like with networking, we have command line utilities we can use for storage. Let me just show you a few. I'm going to flip back to my terminal here, and let's run a few commands here. Let's do ESX CLI storage. So instead of network, now I'm saying storage. And then I'll say core device list. right? Show me the hardware devices that are part of the storage core. And that's going to come up and show me what I've got. And you'll be able to look through here and recognize if your controller is missing or if it's there. I've got this guy right here is my CD-ROM drive. If I keep scrolling up, it's a lot of data, right? Here's a virtual disk that I've got attached. I should have another one. So each of these things are showing up. And if I see a disk missing, then I know I've got a problem that's maybe not here on my ESXi host, but on my SAN, right? Or maybe the HBA is not showing up, or the SATA controller, RAID controller, whatever is not showing up. This gives me a chance to see those disks that my system is seeing. You can also do ESX CLI storage file system list, all right? And that's going to show us the volumes themselves that are mounted. And so I can look down the list and I can see like my VMFS data store. Here's that ESX host 01 local data store. Here's an NFS shared ISO data store, right? So this is even a remote one. And then I've got a couple of these VFAT ones. These are your operating system. You don't usually want to mess with those guys, right? That's where the ESXi OS is stored. And so if those aren't showing up, then you're not getting to the shell anyway. So that's not really something we'll mess with. But these guys up here are the data stores that I'm mounted to. If I see a data store missing, then I know I might have some kind of connectivity or controller issues. So just additional things we can see right here from the CLI. Okay, few other things to think about with storage. If you're doing multipathing, right? If you watched our storage multipathing episode, you know that from the GUI, we can always browse into a host and go into its storage. And let me get back to my hosts. And I'll go into one of my hosts. I'll go to Manage and Storage. And under my storage, you can pick a controller, and right down here you can see the paths that are available. So see how I've got two different paths to get to this one controller, and it's the same LUN available two different ways, and they're both active. Well, maybe one wasn't active, or maybe one's disconnected for some reason. I don't know why. Well, seeing it right here from this screen is usually going to give me the information I need, right? Or I can go to the command line. And in the command line, we can run ESX CLI storage core path list. And that'll give us a list of all the different paths, same as what's in the GUI, but we'll see it right here, and you can spot whether or not you've got your multiple paths the way they're supposed to. So as I look at like this IDE disk, I can see that it just has one target identifier, and it looks like I don't have multiple paths on that one. And who do I have multiple paths for? Let's see. Well, this one is saying unavailable or path not claimed. So this one isn't set up for multipathing. Oh, I know what it is. I have more than one path, but I haven't actually turned on multipathing on the data store. You got to go to the data store to turn on true multipathing, and so mine's detecting the paths, but they're not actually being used yet. So it does give you a chance to see that, and whether the state of a particular path is active or whether it's passive, we can start to spot those and see how that is, right? So a couple of different things that we can see right here from the CLI. All right, usually when it comes to storage, it's not connectivity that we're troubleshooting though. It's rare that we have connectivity there. Maybe the storage fails, in which case you walk into the server room and see the red lights on the disks, right? That's kind of easy to see. Normally it's performance. And there is a great command line utility that we can use. When it comes to storage performance, remember from like the vSAN episode, we had the vSAN Observer. That was a neat tool. You could see all these little graphs and charts. From the regular vSphere web client, you actually don't get that great of storage data. But if you drop to the shell, you can go to one of your hosts and you actually have this really cool tool. It is called ESX top. If you're familiar with the Unix top command, it normally shows you your processes that are using the most CPU, right? So you can manage CPU and memory. But if I run ESX top, it's going to fire up and it's going to output that. Oh shoot! It's because of the way I'm accessing the terminal. Sorry, my terminal client here isn't supporting the animated screen that it's doing. Let me flip over to the native shell on that guy. So I'm going to go back here and do a little Alt F1, and we'll run it right from here. There we go. That's what I wanted to see. This is a lightly animated screen, and so my terminal wasn't supporting the character encoding that it was doing. But what I'm seeing here is a list of all the processes on this system, and I can see the percentage of the system used and wait time and whether it's ready and so on. What I'm actually seeing here is CPU utilization, just like the top command. But the cool part is I can change this view. If you hit the letter U, U is going to change you to disk view. And now I can see each of my disks right here. And if I scroll over, I can start to see the disk I/O percentage being used, the load, the commands per second, reads and writes per second. I can get an idea of how busy that data is. So if there's a data store that I think is being overwhelmed, I can spot that right here. I can look and see if I'm hitting my thresholds. Right now I've only got one data store doing any real work, and most of the time it's idle. So see how they're all 0 now, but for a moment there were a few writes going on, and so I'll see each of those. That was pressing U to get into disk mode. I can press D and get into HBA mode. When I'm in HBA mode, I see each of my controllers, right? So not the individual disks, but the controllers themselves. And so I can look for controllers that are getting overwhelmed. I might have 5 disks on one controller, and one disk might be monopolizing all of the resources. Meanwhile, the other 4 disks are idle. So I might want to move those other 4 disks to a separate controller to optimize performance. So this ESX top command, it is great for all sorts of things, not just for CPU, which is the default, but also for things like storage. It's actually got a ton of different features inside of it, and that'll do it. You just hit Control-C to get out of it, and then you can go back to business.
All right, Don, we've got a few more commands to actually go in terms of troubleshooting, but we are out of time in this particular episode, but there are plenty of troubleshooting tools for us to actually continue to go over. Don's just recently covered it in this episode, right? The idea of just the networking as well as taking a look at those command line interfaces and helping us out as well. So Don, any last minute things?
You know, it's probably not on the exam, Ronnie, but let me show one more tool, just in case something creeps up on the exam. There is a tool called the, actually I think I can switch my regular window now and make it look a little better. It's called the VOMA, right, which is the vSphere on-disk metadata analyzer, which is quite the name. And what it does is it lets you scan a disk for corruption. You know, in like Linux or Unix, we have the FSCK utility. That's kind of what this one is like. That it can scan your virtual storage to see if there's any corruption. And the way it works is you basically just run VOMA, and then you point it to a data store. You need to tell it what kind of data store it is. So I'm going to say -M VMFS, right, versus like an NFS or whatever. I'm going to do a VMFS data store, and then you do -D. And the big long name that the data store has, right? Every data store has a name like /VMFS, /devices, /disks, /NAA dot, and my head's going to cover this up, so we might need to change that, but NAA dot, and then there'll be a long string of numbers, right, that identifies that disk. And we can point at that, and it'll output on the screen an analysis and tell you what's going on. Or you can do a -S and put it to a file, and it'll save the analysis to a file. But that'll scan that disk and look for any metadata corruption. And sometimes if you have a data store that just will not mount, this will fix it. This will let you get around it. And if you don't know what that big long string name is for your disk, you can find that in the GUI. If I go back to my GUI and jump into my storage for a particular data store, when you come in and look at your data store, the easiest way to find it, I mean there's a few ways to find it, but if you just look under files, a lot of times the name of it will be tucked away as a file right on the disk. And I say that and then I'm not seeing it here. But we can also see it under the storage controller. So if I go back under the host, we can go to manage storage and storage devices, and you'll find those names listed in here where it writes them out, and you can see what the name of that disk is. So for example, this one is /VMFS /devices /disks /MPX blah blah blah, versus some of these other ones. I guess blah 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 is not the most technical term, but that's that long name. And so you'd punch in whatever that name is, and then the VOMA can scan that and look for corruption. Like I said, I don't know if that'll turn up on the exam, but it's one I've used in real life. It is one that can happen, and that's the vSphere on-disk metadata analyzer. So just another tool.
And that analyzer, you said, actually fixes the problem too?
Oh yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, nice.
Yep. If it can. Sometimes you have damage data that's beyond that, and it'll tell you that.
All right, well, Don, thank you again for showing us at least those tools in the idea of networking as well as the storage devices that we'll actually have to be able to troubleshoot. But there are plenty more tools to come, and so that will actually be in a part 2 of our series here. And that's a great place for us to go ahead and sign off then. For IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Ronnie Wong.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.